Thank you for inviting me to give this Loicz lecture. My name is Nancy Rabalais, and I'm from the Louisiana University's Marine Consortium in the United States. And this will be somewhat different than the other ones. I am going to live and breathe Loicz in my capacity as a scientist, working on a large catchment that has many problems, and these problems have expressed themselves in the coastal waters. This has been a long process, and I'm going to drag you through some of my experiences in first becoming a scientist and then transferring and becoming a scientist citizen and trying to make a difference in policy, not foreign policy, perhaps influence policy, perhaps advise policy. But in the end, in this 25-year journey, there have been changes accomplished, and I want to share some of that with you. So this is my diagram of how the world works. First, there might be some scientific curiosity about what's going on. You may have a chance to build some hypotheses. These may end up being directed research programs. Some of these directed research programs may be driven by management needs, either known or unknown, or we don't even want to know if there are any toxins from harmful algal blooms in Louisiana waters, because then we might have to do something about it. So then the adaptive management part is the research feeding into developing a management strategy, monitoring, modeling, interpreting, publishing more science that feeds back into an improved management plan. And that circle is the adaptive management and should continue, but should continue to be fed by the science and by somebody who can, by people who can translate the science into some information that can be understood and used by resource managers, water managers, policymakers. This research sort of fell into my lap. We knew that the amount of nitrogen in the world has changed over time. The reactive nitrogen is definitely much greater now than it was historically. And you can see the difference here, and most of it is through human activity, through fertilization and agriculture, through artificial, through fossil fuel burning that leads to atmospheric deposition of NOx components. So it's a very changed nitrogen cycle in the world, and human beings are primarily responsible for that. Whoops. There's also a changed phosphorus loading into the environment. This, however, is there's not an endless end to this phosphorus, but since pre-industrial times to now, there's been much more phosphorus stored in the sediments and delivered to the coastal ocean. So we knew in Louisiana that the nitrate nitrogen had been going up in the Mississippi River, and the person who hired me into Louisiana, Don Bosch, attracted me to these rather lovely trailers that flooded during every hurricane, and put me into one that you can't even see that was actually rat infested. And this is where young scientist Nancy Rabalais, that's a snake around my neck, began her research career. And he had this idea that something might be going on in the Gulf of Mexico. And this was the first political situation that he had backed Senator John Breaux for the election that was won in 1983, which is when I came to Louisiana, and used that political pull to get some money to do some scientific curiosity mapping of where the low oxygen conditions were in the Gulf of Mexico. The low auction area is shown in red at the bottom of this catchment, which is 3 million square kilometers large. And the area that is affected by the low auction is about 30,000 square kilometers, just the area. Not that it covers that whole area, but the area where it's likely to occur. So we began looking at the effects of low oxygen, which are stimulated by the fresh water from the Mississippi River and the nutrients that are delivered. The fresh water creates a stratified water column. The nutrients enhance primary production to the point that an excess carbon is loaded to the bottom. Decomposition uses up the oxygen, and it's not resupplied when there is a stratification and oxygen can't move to the bottom. So we've gone a little bit from the scientific curiosity to the directed research programs. And what we found, not initially, this is the year 2007, what we found initially was a very, not a small, but about 8,000 square kilometer area of low oxygen on the continental shelf extending from the Mississippi River, not quite to the Texas-Louisiana border. It stopped about here in the first year that we measured it. And over the years, we've been doing this consistently, and the area now is quite large. Its largest size ever has been 22,000 square kilometers squared in the year 2002. But it's a massive area when you consider that the definition of hypoxia here is 2 milligrams per liter or 2 parts per million. And if you put a trawl, a bottom dragging trawl over the side, you don't catch anything. No shrimp, crabs, fish, nothing. And other things die as the oxygen continues to go low. So the area of hypoxia, of course, is driven by the river. This is a sediment plume picture of the Mississippi Atchafalaya plumes. About a third of the water comes down the Atchafalaya. And what you don't see here is the dissolved nutrients that are in that plume, and they move much further downstream, especially from the east to the west because of the dominant southeasterly wind forcing in the spring when when the river discharge is the highest and the load of nutrients is also the highest. And we started documenting the stratification and the distribution of hypoxia. The stratification, the strong stratification that you can see here, dictates the oxygen concentrations, which are about 6 milligrams per liter, and here it's 2 milligrams per liter. Most of it less than 1, and some of it very close to 0.5 or even less. And we also started documenting the relationship between the nutrients in the phytoplankton and the flux of the carbon and the low oxygen, and have pretty much found that about 50% of the carbon from the high production in the surface gets to the bottom waters. And we've also been documenting the consequences. Besides the fish being moved out of the area into less optimal feeding and growth and reproductive temperatures and food resources, things do die. We do have some fish kills, but they're more rare because it requires a north wind in the summer to pull the low oxygen water onto the beach. But all the animals that I know and love are in the benthos and in the sediments, and John Downing called these charismatically stressed or dead benthic organisms because they're not furry and most people don't see them or want to see them. But you can see the effects of stressed and dead organisms in the benthos, so that when the low oxygen abates, then they come back in to feed and the resources are decreased. There's also a considerable decrease in biodiversity, and not just species, but whole taxa are not there anymore. And there are some indications that the shrimp catch production has diminished somewhat, but there are a lot of arguments about that. Lots of confounding factors, and not any good economic data, and certainly no ecosystem services cost analysis. So this is how I've been following the hypoxia over the years. And I want to tell you a little bit now about how I've gone from, something's missing here. Oh, well, it's all right. Oop, which one says previous? This one? Okay. So our first political push was in 1985. And around 1993, there began to be, there was an increase in the size of the low oxygen. And let me see, when did Don leave? Don Bosch started this in 85. He left in 1989. He basically just gave me some bro dollars and sent me out into the Gulf of Mexico in a very small boat and said, go forth and study hypoxia. And I brought his very small boat back and said, I need more bro dollars because I need a bigger ship because I'm not going to kill myself studying hypoxia. So we can find out wonderful things, which is great, but I'm not going to do it. So at that point in 93 and maybe even earlier, I decided, well, people really need to know about this phenomenon. So I started putting out a press release every summer at the end of the summer cruise saying how large it was and things like that. And in 1993, it doubled in size. And the smoked crab, the dead spider crab, ended up in an article an inch above the fold in the Washington Post on Sunday morning. So that got John Bro's attention once again, and Olympia Snow, who had been working on harmful algal bloom issues in the Gulf of Maine, I had to keep telling her that the Gulf didn't always mean Gulf of Maine. It meant Gulf of Mexico, but she got over it. They started some harmful algal bloom research legislation. And John Bro co-sponsored as a Democrat to the Republican and put the other H word in, which is Harmful Algal Bloom and Hypoxia Research and Control Act. And that began the formation of the task force, the federal task force that started pulling together the information to assess the status, the distribution, the causes, the economic effects, what can be done about it, what are the nutrients, have they changed over the years. So this started to become a real reality at that point. And the science had been marching on to this point right here, where there was also a cover in Nature talking about the Mississippi River Delta blues. So the science was continuing. The strong science that was supporting taking this information to the policy people was continuing. Let me see. And then so I was already, this picture right here was taken by a reporter on a research vessel, the Acadiana, as a reporter from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. And in these years right here, I started taking more and more media people out on the ship, talking to them on the phone, doing radio interviews. I had a radio interview on a small boat offshore, and we were diving. It was from Minnesota Public Radio. It was one of the strangest things. Well, that's not the strangest thing I've ever done. But the reporter, our station where we had our oxygen meters deployed, was an oil platform. And so every, I don't know how many seconds, the platform would go beep. And so we had to time all of our questions and all of our answers to fit within the beeps from this oil platform Coast Guard signal. So I've had lots of interesting experience. I only lost one reporter once. He sank his sailboat on the way to Cocodrie. And I almost lost one once because she couldn't swim against the current when I told her she could accidentally fall over, because she couldn't go swimming, but she could accidentally fall over, and then we had to go catch her. So anyway, lots of work with the media. And about this time right here, I think it is in here or here, I became involved with a program called the Aldo Leopold Leadership Fellowship Program. in which scientists were trained to translate science to the public, all levels of the public, media, the person in the elevator on the way up. And this is where I started supposedly honing my skills to be a better translator of science to the public. I've made a lot of mistakes, and it's easy to make mistakes, but the ability to do that is, I consider a treasure, because I consider it also my duty as a scientist to translate my information to the public. Just as an example of one stupid thing I did, this was my second training. The lights and the cameras and the reporter, the people that were going to be training me, Jane Lubchenko standing in the background, making me really nervous. And I was just chatting with a reporter who was really somebody who does this for politicians. I mean, a trainer. He was acting like a reporter. And we were just chatting. I said, yeah, the farm, fertilizer business is just really, taking us for a ride in the Gulf of Mexico and blah, 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 because he wanted to know what we were going to talk about. And so then we start the interview, and he says, this is Dr. Nancy Rabalais. And prior to a little while ago, we were talking about the situation in the Gulf. I can't even talk now. It's so embarrassing. The situation in the Gulf of Mexico, and you said that the fertilizer industry was taking the Gulf of Mexico for a ride. What did you mean by that? And I kind of went, I said, and he said, all right, turn out the lights, and we're going to start over. But the lesson is, don't ever say something to a reporter that you don't want to hear again. And I have definitely learned that lesson. So he said, okay, let's just start over and try it again. And so we start, okay, we're starting. Well, Dr. Rabalais, earlier we were talking about your research in the Gulf of Mexico, and you said something about the fertilizer industry taking the Gulf of Mexico for a ride. And he wouldn't stop, and I had to crawl out of that hole. And I still have that film, but I will never watch it ever again. So anyway, there's lots of ways you can get training, and the more you're in the public's eye and try to do things, the more of an effort, or more of a influence you're going to have. And so along all these years, as I do, this was also a TV group that was on board at this point right here. We just had one out with us last Friday. They're doing a documentary on the Mississippi River for Bell Science Museum. And the producer of that has won several Emmys and a Peabody Award. So this is some pretty serious, real good producing that's going on. But over these years, the low oxygen has gotten worse. And the nutrients in the river have increased. And so we still have to keep taking our message to the public, and we still keep doing the science. And the science says that the size of the area in midsummer is most directly proportional to the load of nitrate nitrogen in May plus a year term. And you can see it's got a pretty good fit. It's also related to phosphorus and discharge and everything else, but it's strongest with the nitrogen. So when we look for what's changing in the watershed, we have other scientists working in the watershed, particularly the U.S. Geological Survey, mapping the changes. And as you can see in this watershed, it's mostly agricultural sourced nitrogen, very little from municipals and industrial, very little from atmospheric deposition. The manure is no longer spread over the landscape, but is now in confined animal feed operations. But the biggest change over time has been the fertilizer. And the 300% increase in nitrate N over the last 40 years is due 81% to the increase in concentration and only 20% due to the